Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give it just a minute or so before we get going, but I would love to see where everybody's from in the chat. What school, what state? We have someone from Belgium, some people from Canada today. This is a pretty diverse group. Yes, Lisa. All right. Well, let's kick this off. Welcome, everybody. We're here to talk about design systems that work for everybody. I'm so excited how this topic seems to have resonated. We have a huge group of schools from all over, mostly North America, but again, some from Canada, Belgium, and just some housekeeping to start. We do have Q&A available, so use that little link in your Zoom to ask us questions. We'll try to keep up with those as we go, but we might have to address some of those at the end, and we'll leave some time for that. We are recording this and we'll send that out to you after the fact. Everyone is muted, so feel free to use the chat if you want to interact with us as we go. That's welcome.
I think chat is currently disabled per the Q&A, so
Oh,
maybe we
okay.
can turn that on, but if not, throw your questions in the
Yeah,
Q&A.
Lisa's here in the back end. She'll get that on in just a sec. Thanks, Josh.
Cool.
Okay. Well, I am really excited to introduce this pretty much all-star panel today. And we have Paul Babin, who is the Web Systems Manager at UCLA Health, Chaz Chumley, the lead web platform developer at UCLA Health, Josh Koenig from Pantheon, he's co-founder and senior VP of marketing, and myself, Jeff Dillon. I'm the CEO and founder of EdTech Connect. So I want to start by setting the stage just a little bit. We've heard these things before, but it's important because we're kind of at this perfect storm of digital chaos, I call it. And I first learned about UCLA through a DrupalCon recording I saw. I wasn't able to go this year, but I saw Paul talking about this project, about their project, their transformation. And it was such a compelling story. I'm like, I got to talk to Paul. Talked to Paul, met Josh, had Josh on my podcast, and it was just such a great story. It really humanizes what we're all going through, and it's not just about migration. And it's definitely migration's at the core of this project, but it's really that the human side of this transformation. And higher ed is at this interesting time. Most institutions have challenges with enrollment, either recruitment or retention. There are less college-age students out there. There's more competition. And the way these incoming classes are created is disappearing, right? With the College Board Search Service having virtually no names available. So budget constraints, our budgets, grants, endowments are under extreme political pressure. And it's really stalled innovation in many ways. And I've seen even brain drain from more than the past 10 years with so many of the best people leaving higher ed for the private sector. So we're really the victims of our own success with legacy systems like content management systems that we implemented 10 plus years ago. Now schools have hundreds of content editors, tens of thousands of pages, if not hundreds of thousands of web pages, and it's digital chaos. And I lived this. I was a web director for 20 plus years. So this is where I want to hand it off to Josh to build on this and talk about design systems in this digital context.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so I think this is, design systems are not new. Those of us in the field have been aware of this as a, a technology trend for a while, but I think they're gaining maturity. And I remember, talking to folks 3, 4, 5, this is actually more than 5 years ago because it would have been pre-pandemic, about where we were, and you sort of had first wave adopters of, and chat is on. Yes. First wave adopters who went into the stuff for very good reasons, but then found like, it's complicated. There's all these issues with it. And I think now we're maybe into the third wave of design system adoption. But for those of you who are new to it, this is basically the evolution of what, origin stories of the web would be like a style guide or a set of design assets that were largely, just digital comps, right? Like they're just static digital assets that you would then build with or check things against. And so, we've evolved to where the web is now the default lingua franca of all software user experiences. Not all, but most. It's the dominant one, right? It's taken over from outside of gaming or other like really high-end application development. People don't write this stuff from scratch, and Flash went the way of the dodo, and so now we have these rich experiences that can be built with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And the design system is really bringing the world of designers into that context. So we're expressing design as a library of digital building blocks that are actually real. They run. You can put them in a browser and play around with them, and then connect them directly to operational systems, whether that's web, email, intranet, other custom applications, digital signage, you name it. Like this is part of that, how people are making true this promise of really delivering consistent and high quality digital touch points across a variety of surface areas. It's also a great way to like save money because the truth is that when you invest in a design system, there is an upfront investment, yes, but it can be part of an existing design investment. It's not like extremely more expensive than figuring out what you want your design to be. And then everything else you produce with it downstream gets faster and cheaper and is higher quality. And I think that's one of the reasons why institutions are really moving in this direction. I also think within the context of higher education, there's an opportunity, and you're starting to see it for a lot more, as we've seen with all things open source collaboration. Because while at a brand level, different schools and different universities clearly have their own distinct brands and their own logos and their own iconography and their own colors. I've had great anecdote, if we can get to it later, about how Yale chose their color blue. But underneath that, like, there's not really like the need to competitively differentiate on like some of the fundamental building blocks of digital experience here. This is a place where, as with many other technologies, I think the public sector and education specifically can share and mutually reinforce with one another, and that's a great way to respond to this kind of not so pleasant overall environment where everything is kind of under pressure and under a microscope.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and I'll just, I'll speak very quickly like to like our angle on it, and I want to really get to Paul and Chaz to talk about how this worked in real life for them. But Pantheon has a lot of university customers. We've been really in this space for a long time, and so I'm not just speaking from the stories we have here, but also across a lot of the other trends that we're seeing. And I also like design systems because they fit like peanut butter and chocolate with what we deliver that we call web ops, which is just automating and taking advantage of all the things you need to do to leverage open source technology to its fullest when it comes to the web. And so if you have a large web portfolio and you're thinking about a design system, we can just make those things really sing together and like to help you accelerate up to the highest ladder of that maturity model that I'll talk about in a second. Just we can get through the rest of my slides real quick, actually. The pitfalls to watch out for, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, if you made it earlier, particularly if it was like 5-10 years ago, if you were an early adopter of design systems, you're likely dealing with some amount of technical debt. And if you weren't the person that made those decisions or weren't involved in all the project, like definitely do your research, assess your current situation. There's going to be some amount of rework that's likely necessary, but the best thing you can do about that is just know what you're getting into. A lot of times when they're implemented in a rather simplistic way, you miss out on the sort of omnichannel aspect of a design system, and you end up with a kind of monolithic or brittle implementation that's very coupled one-to-one with a specific CMS or web architecture. That happens for all kinds of understandable reasons, but it's less than ideal. And if that is a case where you feel like you have a brittle system, it's an opportunity to invest in making things flexible in the right way. The other pitfall to watch out for is where the design system was implemented without a particular use case in mind to actually make it real, and so it exists in a like a little glass jar and it's beautiful, and it might even be like that you can log into a website and see the design system, but it's not actually being expressed anywhere. In which case, there's probably also there's definitely work to do to express it, but probably because it was never taken all the way end to end, there may be things that were never accounted for in the system itself. So we're going to talk today about how you get past all those things. And people are at one state or another on this maturity model. This could also be like a web design maturity model, but since we're doing the webinar about design systems, I called it design system maturity model. And like everyone is, at least has a style guide, right? You at least have some standards for your brand, for your colors, for your typography, and so on and so forth. Like that's not new, but in a lot of places, it's still kind of just like written down. It's like it might literally be something that's printed out on paper and is like on someone's desk. The progression from there to fully integrated, living, breathing, real operational design components is a journey. But it's one that you can move on more quickly than you might think. You just need to get the right people aligned around it. You need to get the right resources in place, but then you can ladder up from having a set of guidelines that are really great to have, because without that you wouldn't have anything, to an operating design system that is integrated and automated faster than you might think. And you don't have to take my word for it. I've got two real experts who have lived it, are living it, I should say, right now on the webinar with me. And I'm really happy to be here to discuss this and have Jeff kind of moderate a discussion.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, let's we've set the stage. That's a good lead up to getting the voice of UCLA Health here. So Chaz and Paul, you've both lived through a design system journey. Can you describe the difference between what things look like when they're not working well versus what you've seen with happy users, and just walk us through your project?
I'm sure. And thanks for again, Jeff, having us, Josh, for having me and Paul today to talk through this. So uh, the last slide was awesome, showing the different stages, because I've lived that journey in several different iterations, and most recently at UCLA Health. Maintaining a design system and the challenges of maintaining a design system, and the growth of that really take on a couple different aspects. One is, have you inherited a design system, like Pattern Lab or Fractal, some of the old school ones, and where are you able to then take that and then obviously get that into an operational status on integrating with different aspects of the digital ecosystem. The challenges with, I think, with that we've lived through just from a high level has been obviously getting managing what I call snowflakes, and getting out of the snowflake scenario and into something that's actually can be used across platforms. At UCLA Health, we have the school side with David Geffen School of Medicine. We have the flagship with UCLA Health on the .org side, and so also taking a look at how things are separated as well, and bringing those together into more of an enterprise level has definitely been something of a challenge we've been looking at that. And then really getting into a platform where we can actually make that operational has been a great success, especially with working with Josh and everyone at Pantheon. And as you had mentioned earlier, Jeff, Paul had a great discussion at the Higher Ed Summit at DrupalCon to really talk about that journey. So I'll stop talking myself and let Paul kind of chime in here now.
Well, let's hear what's your take on it.
Yeah, if you want to hear me for a moment, I'll tell you a little bit about my story with UCLA, because I go back 13 years ago and started working with a open source software called OpenACS. And the crazy part about this is most people will never have heard about it, and it's because it's the technology that drove AOL. And it was the most painful experience ever, trying to manage 10 sites with like 60 subsites based off of that, and just trying to get basic updates into those. Take a month to do an update on one of them, and then take whatever you did there and then repeat that 10 times. So that'd be 2 to 3 weeks each time trying to make an update. And the system's still being used, but for very, very niche projects. Then about 7 years ago, we moved into Drupal, and that solved so many of my concerns. I love the ability to be able to do something in a single code base. We're managing over 150 sites now. Started in Pattern Lab, and then Chaz came in, blew that away, and introduced the whole concept of Storybook. So our updates now are super quick. We get them over to our stakeholders super quick. They're able to give feedback. And then we had some challenges with our previous host, and that was what my discussion was at DrupalCon. And then moving into Pantheon has been light years of difference. So I come from it more of the developer standpoint. But on that journey, what has really helped, and I think Josh's slide highlights it, is that governance piece. It wasn't before the governance came in that said, hey, we can no longer have this school of brands. We really need to have a branded school. And it comes down through marketing saying, this is what these things need to look like. And then the Storybooks allows us to share that across the board. So yeah, that's been my journey at UCLA, and we're happy where we're at now.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the sites or areas at UCLA or UCLA Health that were affected the most or most involved?
Majority of these would be just smaller lab sites making updates there, but our flagship and also our main medical sites were associated with this. So I believe Chaz can quote me or correct me that the original .org site was on Cold Fusion. And then making updates to that was definitely a challenge, especially for our content editors. Moving that over to Drupal, again, is light and day. The idea that taking a month or two to make updates via code versus here's some updates, you're in our release cycle for 2 weeks, and sometimes it's just a config change that we might be able to sneak in at the Drupal level.
Hey, Chaz, from a front-end perspective, from Pattern Lab to Storybook, can you talk about some of those end user downstream wins that you've experienced or you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously having we've heard this term a million times, a living, breathing style guide, right? And Storybook, we actually, and I found talking with other universities at DrupalCon and different summits and stuff that some will expose their Storybook instance to the public, some will kind of keep it behind the scenes. I found actually exposing it to our end users has actually been able to foster a lot of wins from us from a standpoint of having other eyes on stuff, because I find kind of living in a siloed world is not the best. So if I'm able to share those components across the UC, and I laugh because when I first started UCLA, I actually submitted a topic for one of the summits called a design system to rule the UC. So I have even bigger aspirations of taking the design system that we have at UCLA, because why should all the UCs in California have to work harder? Let's work smarter, right? And so, and like Josh brought up earlier, a lot of components don't change. We've gone to the days of reinventing the wheel. A hero's a hero, a card's a card, a banner's a banner. So it's just a matter of being able to iterate on those, which is where the other wins came in, because we were able to really focus on accessibility, not only from a visual standpoint, but also from, an user standpoint, whether it's vision impaired, whether it's, keyboard navigable. And so that really able to allow us to kind of follow almost like a pattern like the US web design system, where there's huge focus on A11Y. So we've been able to do that. And it really started on the EDU side, because we've only about a year, getting close to a year now, where the EDU side and the org has come together in what we call MarTech. So taking that same design system, and instead of thinking of it from an EDU side, thinking of it more from an enterprise level, has definitely helped with some big wins from our end users, because our users that we, whether a content editor or just a contributor, are able to actually get in there and see what the block type or the paragraph type or the content type, however they're interacting with the Storybook, and so what's going to look like before they even have to start adding structured content to it. So that was another huge win, because they could get in there and play around with things. And then, in the digital ecosystem and as a whole, we are able to have that exposed, so that, for instance, if our agent force with Salesforce marketing wants to be able to interact with the design system, they're able to take that same branding and utilize that, whether it's a digital billboard sitting somewhere, in a hospital or on the campus. or they're also able to take that same branding, and so they're also not having to reinvent the wheel down the roads.
You mentioned accessibility. There was a comment or a question that already came in. It was more of a comment about, yeah, that's another pitfall of a low mature, immature, design system. Yeah, how do you manage accessibility? That was part of this project? You saw some benefits there too?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it helped. I was actually embedded with the U.S. web design system team for about 6 months prior to coming on board at UCLA. So I've always had, accessibility in mind and kind of think of how an end user is going to interact with it. So definitely from a UX standpoint, that was very important. And then, obviously over the past year being MarTech or marketing technology, having marketing's eyes and ears with the actual designers on the marketing team, content strategists, content editors, and being able to get their feedback has really helped us also in being able to take, components that we've already designed and iterate on them until, they fit the bandwidth that everybody's wanting to use them in.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from you or Paul about, you mentioned governance already, and this is what Josh kind of landed on at the end there, is this maturity that kind of drills into governance. How do you manage that stakeholder buy-in when you're trying to align marketing, comms, IT? That seems like a huge challenge.
Yeah, fortunately, I have not had to deal with the buy-in because of our governance group, which has been amazing. And if you have that clear support from your leadership team, and that's what I can give to anybody, is if there is that clear goal, and then you have things like a storybook instance that you can give to someone and say, hey, this is where we're going to, that buy-in comes in a lot quicker. And then the government's we can start working together because we're no longer an IT team that's like saying you can't do this. It's like, no, this is what we can do within the system. And sometimes people still try to backtrack in and ask for additional things. We can always say, hey, is this really part of the broader scheme that we're trying to help? And if it's not, we can't help at this particular time. So that governance piece has been, I think, the strongest piece, and it comes from, one, aligning the groups, two, saying, hey, this is what we're planning on doing, and then sticking to sticking to that goal and sticking to that view that overarches where you want to be. Because otherwise, we'd still be, stuck, as Chaz mentioned earlier, trying to help with snowflakes. And then one of the things that I think Josh may have missed on his slide is that security is also one of our things that we need to start worrying about. So a lot of the things that we've been doing now have all been security driven. And I think that's another point that we can point to in how we move forward. Because if you got clear security guidelines, that ties into the work that we do as well.
Yeah, it's a great call out. Security and accessibility.
I was gonna say there's a lot of chat and people are interested in hey, can we get access to it? And we can certainly follow up with some stuff about that. Not to hijack, but Chaz, I was wondering if you could also just, because people may not be familiar with the work, talk about the USWDS, and because that is a really big project that I think is under appreciated. You can you can copy it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just copy this really well done starter that the federal government built, and maybe tell the audience a little bit more about that as a thing.
Yeah, definitely. And so I don't know, I think it came around not to get in politics, but the Obama era with making sure that any state and federal organizations were starting to utilize, not reinvent the wheel, right? So to utilize a common set of components, branding, design tokens that had full accessibility behind it. Had a lot of thought put into it, a lot of documentation and guidance, as well as when and when not to use a specific component. And so out of that came the United States web design system, which was at the time led by, I'm going to forget Dan's last name, but a great guy by the name of Dan that managed this and really fostered this through more of crowdsourcing with different organizations and agencies for having people come in and volunteer their time to be able to work on it. And it was really kind of mandated, like I said, as something that needed to be used by different organizations. And so really taking that experience and taking, which was when I first started at UCLA Health about 3 years ago, our storybook instance, and morphing that into, sorry, Paddle instance, and morphing that into our storybook instance, and taking that experience has really helped in guiding that. I know there's a couple questions here real quick, over like if people can actually physically see our storybook instance. So they dropped a link in there that shows it. There's also our GitHub repo, because one of the things that I took from my time at the US Web Design System was creating something that had the lowest barrier of entry. I don't want someone to have to know Webpack or Veets or be a JavaScript expert or CSS. I want to take something that anybody could just pull down a copy of, spin up, and use to your heart's content. So the repo that Paul dropped in there is accessible for anybody to grab and use. Our storybook instance, on the med school side, I dropped a link in there as well. I would drop a link in for our UCLA Health, but we're actually in the middle of a rebrand, as is everybody, right? Out in the wild, wild world, which hopefully will be coming out here in the next week or two. And I'm happy to follow up with Jeff and Josh or on LinkedIn and post that URL once that rebrand is done. But it's in the middle of some flux right now. So
yeah, excellent, great resource. So I want to take this up a level and ask. So I feel like there's a lot of marketers out there that often just want to make a change, and they're like, "Why is it taking so long?" And the IT team needs to, they're taking too long, and they get used to that, but they're frustrated. Can you talk a little bit about this project and how, like the old way, you were consumed with kind of maintenance updates, and that kind of got routine, and you had to break out of that. And what I heard is that that allowed you to open you up for other things. But talk about how it helped your efficiency in your job.
Right. Kind of to put a framing around this is that we are in Drupal at this point. We were with a different host, and in that different host system, there were some workarounds that we needed to do in order to make changes. And because of that, we weren't able to get feedback from our stakeholders early on. There were some other things that would trickle up to when we actually do releases, because it worked on staging. Staging didn't necessarily match what was on live. So when we went to go live, we had some release errors. So that would take, I think we calculated about 52 person hours a year of just addressing these hiccups. When we started doing a POC with Pantheon, a lot of that got taken away because we were actually in control of the automations that we were able to interface with existing tools that Pantheon provides, such as Terminus, and then getting the stuff to people earlier using multi-dev. We were able to kind of shift when we found the environment differences out of being in the getting super technical, so sorry for some of the individuals on the call, but on the environment piece just ended up being way too much of my time and some like Chaz's time, just trying to say, why did it work on staging but not when we went live? So shifting that to earlier in the process allowed us to kind of start sharing the burden of figuring those across all the developers when we spin up a multi-dev instance. And then one of the things that we were missing, actually had to go out to a third party, and it was in one of Josh's earlier slides, was autopilot. Getting that visual regression testing piece in that pipeline, helps us as developers know, okay, this is definitely something that we did not intend. So we can hold off on releasing and having to do hot fixes later on. So all of that process was not helping us being able to reach some of the goals that marketing would ask for. Individuals are asking for new components. If you're dealing with some of this technology stuff, these hiccups, you're not going to be able to work on those. So since moving over to Pantheon, I've been able to have more fun in what I call my sandbox, which is basically just developing tools for the developers to speed up and automate a ton of redundant processes. On the .org side, we are still working with the other hosts, so there are opportunities on that side to also speed up these processes. But it's unpeeling an onion. You have to ask the question, why are we doing this when, one of the things I just found out is our DDEV system was still supporting or is using MariaDB, but the host is on MySQL. So how are you going to catch some of those database differences when your local environment isn't even matching the host environment? And also found out that that host environment is still on MySQL 5.7. I'm just questioning what's going on with that story. So being able to remove that technical stuff allows us to make these updates, and then our end users don't have to worry about this. They just see updates coming in on our regular release cycle every 2 weeks. They ask for something, they may get it 2 weeks later.
So your end user, let's say they're a content editor or a marketer or marketing colleague, what are some examples of how they felt this difference, immediately?
I can think of one where an individual needed a customized email to go out with some, was it changes in a workflow? Technically, this would need to be put into code and then pushed up to our pushed up to the server. One of these was the VIP, so I'm like, let me just go to the site directly. I can update that in the site itself and then export all that and put it back into the code. So they actually got an immediate change to their site without having to wait for that whole release process. So probably not the best practice, but it allows me to at least get get our end user happy and excited about our agility. We were a group of 3 people doing this work. So when we get those small wins, we definitely want those small wins because we want people to trust us.
One of the things I would say, and listen to that, Paul, and thanks for saying all those nice things about Pantheon, but I feel like there's this just broader industry thing with web developers where we're still moving the technical resources out of literal like production work to get content and experiences, but it's largely all just content. Get content out to there's that overall thing of like shift left, right? So like you discover issues in the process and bugs earlier so you can fix them in an orderly manner versus it being a fire drill. But also like you get to spend more of your time working on building blocks and tools that other people can then use at the last mile to self-serve on an increasing number of tasks. And so like, in a world where I don't think anybody believes that like technical resources are not constrained, right? There's a multiplier effect on what you get out of those resources when they're managing a system of reusable components that can then be assembled by civilians in these different roles at the edge. And that's just a huge, like, that's not specific to us. That's not even specific to design systems. That's just like a good, thoughtful use of talent that is a trend that's going on in the industry that I just want to encourage as much as possible.
Yeah, I can give a direct example to that. Like with .org and .edu, we still have a bunch of areas that we can't allow for whatever reason our end users to make edits to. So we will get 4 to 5 ServiceNow tickets on a weekly basis to just make simple updates. Whereas on the .edu side, we have these tools in a controlled manner, and our content editors make those changes without having to wait for that ServiceNow ticketing process.
Examples. So I want to ask kind of everyone, like anyone can take this question, but from your perspective and your different roles, what are the signs that a design system is holding university back? I feel like we're talking to universities who already are trying and they're doing something, like we're talking about Storybook and these design systems. What practical steps can help schools get back on track?
I think, again, getting back to it's a common thread here, not reinventing the wheel. So I saw a similar question come into the webinar chat. So when we ventured on this, we already had Pattern Lab, right? And so we knew that we wanted to be able to take something that was a design system and an old technology, but bring it to the forefront to make sure we weren't on the bleeding edge, but we were on the edge where we needed to be of high adoption and stuff. And so we sought out this journey of like really meeting with other people in the community. Whether it was other agencies, Forum One, Lullabot, Evolving Web, Fort Kitchens, the ones that where if you went and said Drupal Storybook, those were the people that popped up. So we actually physically met with each of those organizations, saw how they were working with their design system, what they were integrating with, what tools, from JavaScript tools to CSS tools to documentation to repository, all the things that we knew that we were going to need to be able to use to see if we were on the right track. And then after meeting with them, said, well, if we're going to have to learn something new, if it's Webpack, which isn't really new, but would be new to us, is there something else out there? And so that's where we then settled on tools like Vite, which is a very high performance JavaScript compiler that's actually Storybook now uses by default, and is about, I don't know, 1,000 times faster when it comes to compilation, because it does things like hot module replacement without getting too technical. Is starting to talk tribal talk for those people that may not fully follow on that. But looking at those and then trying to maintain that lowest barrier of entry, like I said, is where we ended up going with. And so we rolled our own when it came to the end run, and then being able to actually start compiling those, getting those out, allowing people to see it, and then taking what we did and going back to Form One and those other types of agencies that were out there to say, okay, this is what we ended up with. And we were very surprised. And for the past like 2 or 3 years, I've been speaking at camps and cons, and there's this, especially from the higher ed, there's been this huge like magnet of people wanting to talk to us, because what we turned around and then produced, the other agencies were like, oh, I didn't think about that. That's great. And so they started taking and adopting stuff. And so you had this, I'm going to show my age here, synergy, right, between the community of what was going on. And I think that's what's awesome about, really taking and designing or creating a design system from scratch, is being able to take the best of breed approach to something, but then getting, 1,000% validation that you went down the right road, because people are wanting to grab pieces of it back from you. And then we adopted Vite before Storybook even adopted Vite. So then seeing the Storybook actually adopted, we were like, oh yeah, home run. We hit that one out of the park. So I think that definitely helped.
Yeah. I'm going to pause and look at some of the questions we have coming in, but in the meantime, Josh, if you had any questions, let me know.
Well, I was doing the same. I think we've talked a lot about technology, and I also wanted to take a step back from that too, just to hear. So I have seen across our universities that we've seen go on this journey, and some of them are early and some of them are late, but this journey of bringing together the institution around this use case. The human and organizational side of it is super important. And I'm actually curious for you guys to get done what you've gotten done. What did it look like in terms of getting executive sponsorship, getting buy-in? What were the key teams that had to come together, or people that you needed to convince, or that were critical to have as champions? How did the organizational side of it come together for you?
That's a great question, Josh. Definitely. Well, each UC is different, right? With whether or not they are integrated in with their marketing team, whether or not they're separate, whether it's the traditional marketing and communications and IT kind of sitting in the middle type of scenario, because that's where all your roadblocks and your red tape starts to come in. And so at UCLA, we were advantageous from the standpoint that coming from the EDU side, from David Geffen School of Medicine, we already had a really tight integration and communication with our marketing execs. And then when we became MarTech, there was a little bit of, I think, where a lot of people probably struggle with, of trying to get buy-in from different stakeholders. What was key, I think, for us was, we had something already existing that we could show them, but we had a feedback mechanism to where requests could come funnel down through marketing into our backlog, so to speak, of things that we were working on, so where we could quickly turn around and be like, oh, I would go design it in Storybook and like, oh, is this what you had in mind? No. And so you moved away from that whole traditional waterfall. We were able to quickly iterate on something, get their feedback. And so they had whether it was implied or not, had the voice, and were being heard from the very get-go on what we were working on, instead of taking something, working on it and go, and then just pushing it out to production, maybe that's not what they really wanted to speak. And so definitely getting those key stakeholders that feel like, they're part of the process, listening to the feedback, and saying, and this is one of my favorite terms. Paul's gonna laugh when I say this. I don't play politics, so I always tell everybody, if you think something's BS, call BS, but tell me exactly what it is that you want to see instead. Don't call BS and then just like go off into the distance. And so I think that's also definitely kind of fostered a really honest and open communication channel with marketing and different key stakeholders, and not being able to, maybe hold back or be afraid to ask what they're really wanting to hear.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd also throw in there that I keep on forgetting that I have to, remind myself is we have an excellent digital strategist, the name of Kristen Lindberger, that has spent years actually going out and doing like, again, I'm not the marketer, so I'm going to forget the terminology, but we'll interview the students. We'll ask them, A and B, do you like this look versus this look? And, how can we meet your needs? And I think when she came back with the designs and the stories that came from the students, we got greater buy-in by the deans who wanted to move forward with this project. So it really became important to make sure that this felt like a collaborative process. And I think that she did an excellent job of pushing that forward.
I have a good question I want to throw out there, kind of a big question for the panel about executive sponsorship and funding and approval. How do you allow for innovation in a program like this that you succeeded in, or absent of this executive sponsorship? How do you gain it or work independent of it?
Work every weekend.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Every person's going to have a different scenario or situation, right, that they're in when it comes to that question. So I think in general, it's just having the confidence in yourself and your team, having the drive in your team, the passion of wanting to create something really good, and then just having the good communication skills, and channels with marketing, communications, external stakeholders, and feeling like they have the voice. I think those all together help with that, because there are things where, like, no, we don't have the funding to do that, especially in today's landscape. A lot of us are experiencing that, whether it's being able to hire additional people, whether it's we're lucky enough to be able to work with like-minded vendors on the products that we're trying to push out. And so I think passion, number one, I think, and the dedication is really what kind of helps trump that, when you don't always have the stakeholders, budget and time to take advantage of.
Well, one thing I'd say, like, and Paul, it sort of came out in your example, is always like start with the why. Understanding what the institution wants to accomplish, and then you can tie that back into, we want to make sure that we're delivering stuff that's relevant and feels good to students. So that's important. So then we put the work in to figure out what that is, and we demonstrate that we've got a material improvement here. And even in cases where people are responding to resource constraints, people say, like, you got to spend money to make money. You also have to spend money to save money in a lot of cases, if you want to do it in a long-term sustainable fashion, right? And I think where you have an honest conversation about goals, then you can think creatively and maybe think like slightly longer term about what are investments we may need to make in the short term so we can see the payoff we need to see in the long term. And I think that getting people into that mode of thinking is really key. If you can, right? Because a lot of times I think the challenge with executives and stakeholders is they A, don't have a lot of time, and B, are often themselves kind of stuck in a reactive mode. So figuring out how you can get people to think about goals and objectives and in like a time horizon that's longer than the next 6 months is really important.
So
a marathon, not a sprint, as you're evident, Josh, with our journey coming over to UCLA. So.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and if I can dovetail into that as well, I'm thinking from from a developer's perspective, but this can come from a marketer or leader or something, is find something that you're passionate about itself, and then start working towards on what time you can that doesn't eat into your other time, developing that, and then you can give a fully baked product to somebody. In my case, I'm thinking I started exploring DDEV because we were working in Lando, and I couldn't really get buy-in at that time. Chaz came in, and I already had a branch of DDEV ready to go, and he's like, "Hey, I want DDEV versus Lando," and we were able to go off the races because that was already in there. And that was just because of a small pet project that I wanted to do that didn't eat into other time. So if you're a marketer and you're interested in that student journey, maybe take a little bit of time and ask for that, so that then you can turn in something that can help that buy-in.
I have a story I have to tell real quick on this executive buy-in, and it's a true story, and I'm calling it really the Ivy Digital Challenge. And I'll tell you why in a second. It's that silos don't shrink as institutions grow; they multiply. And as you move up from a small college to a large research university, schools, departments, they often run like independent kingdoms with their own budgets, technologies, and brands. And we're about protecting our brand here, and so it makes a unified voice almost impossible. So this R1 famous school that we all know, I can't name any names here, but this is true. A donor came and said, "Hey, we want to give you $50 million, but we want naming rights to this college." And when the IT team heard about this, they were in panic mode. This school had every CMS out there. This name was everywhere. They're like, "We don't know if we can do that on this timeline." So just one example, we're getting not directly related to design system, but it's about overall protecting your brand. And yeah, I just, you would all know these schools. And I don't like calling it the Ivy Digital Challenge because it kind of seems so pretentious, but it directly correlates with the decentralized nature of the size of your school as you go up the chain. Like I've never seen a large school that doesn't have this problem, and it's the worst at the Ivy level. So no question there, just my comment, one story.
Yeah, less
I
the
told
question,
Josh
more
I
of a
talked
comment.
about that on the podcast.
No, totally. But that's also one of the places where we see the stuff paying off, because when you do it right, the design system lets you manage the inevitability of there being lots of technologies at play and still be able to like keep them, on within the same brand guidelines and honestly offer the acceleration. We had a really big state school, not in the UC, but another like really large public university. And they did something really early, so they were like, it's kind of interesting. They were in that first wave, and they didn't even use a design system. They didn't even use Pattern Lab. They had like one, like a really good little, again, small but mighty team in their communications office that I think they just built something on top of like Twitter Bootstrap, but it was really well done. It was really easy to pick up. It was really well documented. And they just got people across campus like using it like crazy. And mainly because it made their lives so much easier. They didn't have to think about doing all this extra like kind of grunt work implementation to like fiddle around with stuff that was, from the IT's perspective, ultimately non-functional, right? And then what they found out, like later on, they matured and they actually adopted a design system and everything else. But what they found out was when there was a change that came down from the provost that was like, the footer needs to no longer have these links, and there was probably a really good reason for it, but as I got it through the game of telephone, it was one of those classic, the provost said it, so it's an emergency kind of situations. They got through it in like a week because they like had they at least adopted some common structure and some common code across most of their surface area. So like that's just an example of where if you can get the right, and again, there's no accounting for egos and there's no accounting for fiefdoms, but honestly, that when it's done right, this stuff just does make everyone's jobs easier, and so you can kind of get self-interest to break down the silos a little bit, which is, honestly, the only way to do it that'll last.
So we got 10 minutes left here, and we do have a couple questions. I think I'm going to be able to keep up with these questions. I'm going to answer those first, but the accessibility piece was mentioned, and we know it's challenging. Can you talk a little bit more about how you manage that? Is there any more to talk about with the accessibility, Chaz or Paul?
So we're lucky at UCLA because we actually have a team that focuses on accessibility. So and not just for our site, but for the whole ecosystem at UCLA. So they will go and we have new components. We're thinking about rolling out new components. We have the luxury of being able to have them go and take a look at it to make sure we haven't missed anything from an accessibility standpoint. So I think if you do have a team or even an individual, right? At your UC, and you're not taking advantage of that person, definitely reach out to them, see if they have the bandwidth. You'll be surprised on just the little things that you might miss, especially when you're so focused on just developing or designing something.
Great, thank you. And then this one might be for Paul. Can you share any tips or tricks for migrating massive amounts of content from legacy systems to into newer ones?
Yeah, I was looking at that one trying to find a nice easy answer, but I don't really think there is one. We got super lucky with our migration from the other host into Pantheon because it was a structure, similar structure into the same structure. And so I was able to automate everything. And the beauty of that was, I think 3 hours took the whole process of 150 sites from one system to the other. The migrations, if you're in Drupal, it will take a lot of upfront work, but that could significantly help you, especially with some crawling. But any automation you can do it. I'm a huge fan of a robo task runner. Again, if you're in the Drupal world with a PHP process, that is it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. If you're familiar with Drush, if you're familiar with Terminus, the robo task runner is what makes that such a nice command line interface. So you can build that yourself, and that can help. And then when all else fails, if you are at a school, leverage your students. We did that a lot, to where it's just a lot of copy and paste. And sometimes you can't get that legacy content nicely structured into a structured system. So you need that eyes on it. And maybe one of these days, we'll have an AI agent that will do it for us. But until then, that's what I can recommend.
So I was just gonna chime in. You ended it perfectly, Paul. Like, we joked at the beginning of this, like, can we get AI in the headline of this thing? And like, no, because it's not authentically part of the story. And I'm a big, people have seen me talk on this before. Like, I'm not a hater, but I'm an AI skeptic, because I do think hype has a way of generating its own momentum. However, I will say that I have seen some really interesting work being done on this question of moving legacy content that often isn't even in a database, right? Or if it is, the database is from forever ago and wasn't set up very smartly in the first place. And it is, there are people doing really interesting things with, what LLMs are capable of in terms of taking, outside in, looking at what's on a web page and then fitting that into a content model that you're going towards. And it's not like, it doesn't make it all happen magically, but Paul, it is very much like in the spirit of what you said, right? When there's a lot of copy and pasting to be done and a light amount of like thinking to just note, oh, that's the author, copy paste that there. That's something that I do feel like, if not today, very soon, we will be able to leverage AI to help us with. And that's going to be really exciting, because I think it's going to eliminate a lot of, a lot of friction and a lot of the gravitational pull that keeps a bunch of these old legacy systems in place, because you can't, in many cases, you can't decommission the websites. You can't turn them off. The content's important for historical context, or it's still valuable, but the lift to get it into a modern system is so much that you just keep the legacy system alive. I think that the balance of push and pull on that is I don't guarantee anything, but may end up changing sometime in the not too distant future.
Yeah, there's also barriers with that, with higher ed, especially between ethics and biases on how AI is used, and so we're in the early infancies at UCLA of actually being setting up our own LLM, starting to focus on using it, and then obviously, as we've seen, the cost of using AI can be a barrier as well.
Well, I want to close it out. We have 5 minutes to go, and we've caught up on questions, so feel free to drop any more of those. We should be able to get to another question or so. But to the panel, if you could give one piece of advice to a university that feels like their design system is slowing them down, what would it be?
Email me or call me. I'm happy to. I say this all the time. I'm not joking. I'm happy to speak with other, higher ed institutions, and I often do, on exactly, how we got to where we were, what was the journey we took. That's another reason why we share our storybook instance, so that you can at least have a model to play around with, or even utilize. A big mentor of mine a long time ago said, "Get it out of my head and into others." I'm a firm believer in that, and I preach that all the time.
All right, Josh, you've just put a link in the chat, so if you're
Oh,
click
I'm
on
gonna delete that. It didn't work. I'll get the link in a second. But to answer the question, I mean, I think if you're in the situation where there's something in place, but it's a little underloved or there's shortcomings to it, find the time to do some open-ended greenfield exploration, and just don't get too tied down initially by your current state. To both know your current state and where the shortcomings are and why there's pitfalls and so forth. But I think also sometimes that can really limit people's thinking. I think if you're going to go into this, try to make space to go into it with fresh eyes. Set aside 48 hours, like do a 2-day hackathon and see what you might get going. If you have a quick way to get something spun up and can play around with, you might surprise yourself with what kind of momentum that can create in an organization where, legacy stuff can start to feel like, it's just a boulder you're carrying behind you, and people, it can limits your thinking. So find a way to break out of that, and then, come back to it and figure out what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I put the last slide up there for you, Josh. You want any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I think this has been great. Thank you so much for facilitating, Jeff. Paul, Chaz, I mean, again, huge fan of the work that you've done, and thanks again for making the time to tell the story with us.
All right.
Thank you all.
Yep, definitely. Thank you. Appreciate everybody's time.